Good morning, friends. What a venue. I love it. And looking at your faces and knowing a little bit about who you are, I'm reminded that when I started Yale Center for Faith and Culture, one of my kind of guiding ideas for the center was to generate fresh ideas with legs. And I see many of you here engaged and interested in fresh ideas, but also ideas that make difference in the world, way we live our lives and way we conduct our lives, not just as individuals, but also as communities, also as a nation, also as a one global world. A few years back, I started teaching a course with ex-Prime Minister Tony Blair entitled Faith and Globalization. It was motivated by the sense that faith traditions and globalization processes are among the two most important factors shaping the world today. Globalization processes, we're all familiar with them. Our world is getting increasingly interconnected, not just interconnected, also intertwined, intermeshed, interdependent. In some ways, you can say that everything is always, can be always, everywhere, right? So incredibly intermeshed as people we are. On the wings of globalization processes also was carried the ideal throughout the world of democracy. Democracy is one of those ideals, together with human rights, that kind of motivates imaginations of most people in the world today, even though we understand that in democracy, quite different things often. That's as much as globalization, I want to say. But on the faith side of things, it's an old story by now that faiths are not going away. To the contrary, faiths are experiencing a resurgence. Faiths in the world, major faiths in the world, particularly Islam, Christianity, Buddhism, are growing and growing at a relatively fast pace. The world is becoming more and more religious place rather than less and less of a religious place. Consequence of that is, of course, that people of faith have also found themselves interested not just in faith as their private spirituality, but also faith that shapes the public life, community life, and public life of a nation. And partly that was influenced by the democratization, by the spread of the democratic ideal. So you've got people of different persuasions, different views, overarching perspectives of life, living in the same space and also wanting to shape that same space according to the account of life, good life, that they seem to embrace and embrace vigorously. I have described this kind of situation with a phrase, living under the same roof. I mean, the world was diverse for a long time, right? It's that we are now, as diverse people, started becoming intermeshed. It used to be that you could sequester people of particular type in particular regions, bound by nations, and then they could, with relative ease, with tall fences, live in peace with one another. Now, tall fences are gone. Fences are gone, period, which means we live within the boundaries that we have set up, nation states. We live, many of us, under the same roof. And that presents for us major challenges how to organize our public life, and certainly presents major challenges how we as Christians should live in our public life. I think what we've seen also then is a kind of resurgence of two phenomena. On the one hand, something like religious totalitarianism almost, or I can't pronounce authoritarianism, the word, as distinct from, strictly speaking, totalitarianism, which wants to kind of dominate the public space, a single religion wanting to dominate the public space. On the opposite side of things, you have something like secular exclusivism. Because various religions want to insert themselves into public space, often secularists themselves think it'll create conflicts, and therefore the best account that we can have of how to live peacefully in a common world is to secularize. But neither of these projects will work. Kind of religious totalitarianism won't work because we live in a plural world. We live in a world of many religions, each one of which wants to have their say in the public realm, and secular exclusivism will not do because we live in a world of ascendant religions and religions that want to assert themselves in public realm. And so if we work with the idea of kind of single polity dominated by single ideology, I think this is a recipe for conflict, and I think what we need to do, and that's what I try to argue in the book of Public Faith, is we need a genuinely pluralistic political stance, and we need that genuinely pluralistic political stance informed by the deep convictions of our faith. We need to give up on the idea of anything like Christian Europe, or Christian America, or Muslim Egypt, and I can go down the line. We need to give up on the ideas of secular Europe or secular America as well. We need to think in terms of pluralistic space in which people from different backgrounds with different accounts of life, and that means for us Muslims, Buddhists, Christians, secularists, will have equal voice. And we need, I think, if it's going to work, we need religious, in our case, in my case, Christian foundation for something of that sort. Now, the question is there a Christian foundation of a pluralistic account of public life? And I want to suggest to you that there definitely is, and indeed I want to argue that in the context of pluralism, this is the way that Christian faith nudges us, pushes us to go. Now, some people think that religions are by their very nature exclusive, and therefore their very exclusivism will prevent them from embracing pluralism as a political project. There's some truth to that. Yet I'd want to argue the very opposite. And first, let me just take you a little bit back into history. Where does pluralism as a political project have its origin? Well, there was this guy, right, in the 16th century England, a very fervently religious guy whose name was Thomas Helwys. Thomas Helwys. He was a Baptist. He had to flee persecution, went to Amsterdam, and in Amsterdam came up with then revolutionary idea that government shouldn't meddle into the affairs of religious people, and that all religious people, including also the religion of atheists, all people with different persuasions about account of life, will have exactly the same freedoms. And he did that just because of his strong Christian convictions, and not despite of them. And what he didn't do is simply say, I'm a persecuted minority, let me have freedom of religion for myself, but I won't worry for freedom of religion of others. Now that's the story that you have of Mayflower, of John Winthrop, right? Where you escape persecution, but then establish a state in which your form of religion is the dominant religion and sanctioned by the power of the state. And so you've got then back and forth between John Winthrop and Roger Williams. But in both cases of Thomas Helwys and Roger Williams, you have deeply religious convictions leading these folks to embrace something what I would in retrospect call pluralism as a political project. Now, historically, that has been the case. I think there are also major Christian convictions that lead us in that direction. And here I want to build briefly on one of the most famous texts on toleration by one of the most famous political philosophers, which is John Locke. There's a text on toleration, and he gives there specifically Christian reasons why we should practice toleration. And his specifically Christian reasons go something like this. There should be freedom in the way in which people come to faith. Faith concerns the deepest convictions of our lives that regulate all of how we behave, and faith, therefore, ought to be embraced by heart, as the Apostle Paul says, and heart ought not to be ruled by anyone else, but by God. By the way, that was also Thomas Helwig's conviction. The king is for the body, but for the soul. That's the provenance of God, and therefore, in your soul, decisions of your soul have to be free before God. Freedom in coming to faith. And by the way, that's not a new idea from Christian perspective. It's a very much an old idea. Church fathers have advocated this idea, the freedom of us standing before God on our own, embracing the faith. And second, Locke argued, is that love should qualify the way in which faith is lived in the world. And if you love, consequence of love is that you would grant to another person what you want granted for yourself, right? And notice now, you can't simply deny the other person freedom of faith, right? Because he's already argued that freedom of faith is inherent to the character of faith. And the reason why Locke has argued that way is because he knew very well that there are folks who thought that you can coerce people to certain conformities on account of your charity. Because you love them, you'll coerce them, right? Famous Augustinian principle, right? But Locke combined the two, freedom in coming to faith and love in exercise of faith. And if you have these two convictions, I think you have a foundation for something like pluralistic account of public life. Now, the question then becomes, well, is it possible for us? We have these convictions, but is it possible for us to actually live together? Doesn't common life under the same roof presume certain commonalities? And if you don't have those commonalities, how are you going to live together, right? And often what's being brought against this idea is that, well, each of these groups, in our case Christians, are distinct groupings, right, with distinct convictions. So how is it that they can live together with those that are others? And that's partly based on the idea, on the conception of identity. Who are we as Christians? And then the response often is, Christian is something that is specific to us. We are Christian on account of our difference from other people. And that's exactly, I think, where the problem lies. To be a Christian means to be different than somebody else, right? Than other groups. But it doesn't mean simply and purely to be different. I am a Christian on account of specific Christian convictions, and I'm a Christian on account of many common convictions that I have with other folks. I think it's a J. Crew jacket. There's nothing unchristian or specifically Christian about the jacket one wears, right? One may ask whether one has spent now too much or too little money to buy the jacket, right? But the jacket, qua jacket, is just kind of almost generically, specifically cultural jacket that has, irrespective to what we as Christians might or might not think. And the idea is basically rooted, you see it in the Gospel of John. Jesus Christ in John 14 says, I'm the truth. But it's the same Jesus who at the beginning as a word says that he's the one who enlightens everyone. So the specific Christian convictions are the convictions that also can be found through specific Christian convictions are not opposite to the conviction that can be found in many other parts of the world, other people who embrace other accounts of life. All truth is God's truth, and therefore we can and we do have overlapping convictions which can lead us to make it possible for us to lead a common life while not giving up on the specificities of our faith. So we have historical precedent. We have good basic convictions to tell us that we can embrace pluralism political project. We have a foundation for it in commonalities as well as differences. What often stands in the way of embracing pluralism as a political project, I think, is more the deep spirituality. It's what we do with our convictions and not what these authentic Christian convictions are. Let me tell you a story. Immediately after the war in former Yugoslavia, in Bosnia, I was visiting Sarajevo. I was part of the Building Bridges seminar organized by the Archbishop of Canterbury, and it was on justice and common life in Sarajevo, divided Sarajevo. And I had enough of dignitaries and papers and so forth and went to see my good Franciscan friend. We went up on the hill, had a great meal. Looking down, we see all these sea of new mosques that are being built. And he says to me, Miroslav, we have lost the fear of God. I said, what's fear of God have to do with it? He says, well, look at these mosques. Why do you think they're being built? Not because there's some strong Muslim piety there, but we are marking the territory. They're all signs of almost like a religious identity of occupation of particular space. And why do we do that? Because we fear each other. But we have lost the fear of God. I tell him, you know that just 120 kilometers south in Mostar, there is a huge cross, a 100-foot cross erected on the mountaintop from which Croatians, Christians used to shell Bosnian Muslims. And now there is a lighted cross day and night. You can see it kind of imposing and ruling this whole region. Says, you make my point. Christians and Muslims fear each other and use religion as a tool in their struggles with one another, but we do not fear God. One of the most fundamental things I think we can do is to retrieve properly understood fear of God, reverence for God, reverence for Jesus Christ, God of all people, and reverence for Jesus Christ, who on the cross died so that all people can find space in the embrace of God and be free to embrace that very God. Thank you very much.